So, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of the luncheon, and Colonel Haddon is going to have to be leaving us fairly shortly, so I'd like to get his talk underway. For those of you who don't have a program in front of you, and I can see there are many of you in that condition, I'm just going to read this introduction about my good friend Gerald. Gerald Haddon was appointed Honorary Colonel of the Canadian Forces School of Aerospace Technology and Engineering, 16 Wing, Borden, Ontario from October 2010 to April 2014. Gerald is the grandson of Honorary Air Commodore, the Honorable J.A.D. McCurdy, the first British subject to fly a heavier-than-air aeroplane in the British Empire on February 23, 1909, on Brador Lake in Baddeck, Nova Scotia, in an aeroplane called the Silver Dart, which he designed and built with the aid of the members of the Aerial Experiment Association. In that flight, Gerald and I had the pleasure of recreating with Bjarne Tryggvason, an astronaut, at the controls, if you can call it that, of the Silver Dart replica that was built largely in Windsor, Ontario, on February 23rd, 2009, on an icy cold day in Baddeck, Nova Scotia, when Bjarne, through some dint of particularly good engineering and weight and balance adjustments on the frame of the Silver Dart, made that aeroplane fly. A very unstable aircraft, to be sure, but it was quite a day, and one that I know Gerald and I will never forget. So Douglas McCurdy, 100 years earlier, had flown the first Silver Dart, and now I'd like to invite Gerald up here to tell you something about that and to give some of his recollections of his grandfather and some anecdotes from his life.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you all. It is a singular honor to be invited to deliver the Turnbull Lecture, and I would like to thank Jeff Langadoc for his gracious invitation to address this eminent gathering. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated by flight for much of his life, drawing sketches of flying machines over 500 years ago. Equally captivated with the mystery of flight was a young boy born in the hamlet of Baddeck, Nova Scotia on August 2nd, 1886. There is a perimeter roadway within the confines of Toronto International Airport, Canada's busiest airport, called Silver Dart Drive. Many of you are probably unaware of its historical significance to Canada, but here Canadian aviation began when J.E.D. McCurdy shook loose the frozen bonds of Brador Lake on February 23, 1909, when he made the first controlled flight of a heavier-than-air machine by a British subject anywhere in the British Empire, in Baddeck, Nova Scotia, in a fragile airplane he designed and built called the Silver Dart. I stand before you as the proud grandson of the man who many consider to be the father of Canadian aviation, Honorary Air Commodore, the Honorable John Alexander Douglas McCurdy, known as John the Baptist for being the chief force behind the founding of the Royal Canadian Air Force on April 1, 1924. He was acclaimed the first member of Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame with the following citation: "The dedication of his engineering talents to the development of manned flight was a prime factor in the birth of North America's aviation industry and has proven to be of outstanding benefit to Canadian aviation." In 1959, the chairman of the National Geographic Society, Gilbert Grosvenor, wrote that he had known Lindbergh, Amundsen, Byrd, Perry, Shackleton, and stated, "I regard J.E.D. McCurdy as a man who ranks with the very greatest of these." I would like to introduce you to the pilot who guided me in the early years of my life, my grandfather, the Honorable J.E.D. McCurdy, a gentleman whom I knew for the first 19 years of my life. My earliest memories of him come from summer holidays spent in Bedeque with my grandparents as a young boy, with visits to Government House in Halifax when he was Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. Their home was nestled on a 3-acre plot of land on the scenic Bredor Lake, with a view overlooking Bedeque Bay, from where my grandfather made his historic flight. One afternoon, my grandfather described to me how aviation history was made. The day was cloudless, the temperature -15 with no wind. And it seemed almost the whole countryside had turned out to see what was going to happen. Many of the old-timers had come fully prepared to witness the crash. Finally, several people on skates positioned the Silver Dart on the ice. And after checking that all was in order, my grandfather gave the signal to let go. The Silver Dart had gone about 100 feet when all of a sudden she rose gracefully into the air to an elevation of about 30 feet, traveling at 35 miles per hour for 3/4 of a mile. McCurdy's historic departure from the pole of Earth, he was the 9th man in the world to fly a heavier-than-air machine, was noted around the world. What my grandfather recalls most about the flight were the highly skeptical villagers who had come to see what would happen and had predicted disaster, and the excitement on the face of Alexander Graham Bell. Everyone was thrilled by what they had just witnessed and urged my grandfather to go up again. He said it was as if he'd had about 2 or 3 shots of whiskey. He immediately wanted to go up again. However, recognizing the significance of what McCurdy had accomplished, Dr. Bell said, "What we have seen just now may well prove to be one of the really important pages in history. Douglas, you can fly her again tomorrow if you like, but that's all for today." Following this remarkable achievement, the next day my grandfather flew the Silver Dart 4.5 miles, and the day after that, an astonishing 20 miles. How then did Alexander Graham Bell and J.E.D. McCurdy meet? And how did the two families become so close? With his wife and 2 daughters, Bell came to Nova Scotia in 1885 to escape the oppressive summer heat and humidity of Washington, D.C., and stumbled upon one of the scenic jewels of Canada, the picturesque hamlet of Bedeque, situated on the Bredor Lake in the heart of Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. One day, as Dr. Bell was walking along Bedeque's High Street, he happened to glance through the window of the Cape Breton Island Reporter and noticed the editor trying to fix his telephone. Bell entered the office, offered to help, took the phone, expertly dismantled it, and pulled out a dead fly. After reassembling the telephone with lightning dexterity, he returned it to the astonished gentleman, who turned out to be Arthur McCurdy, J.E.D. McCurdy's father, my great-grandfather. When the startled Arthur McCurdy asked the big man standing in front of him how he had fixed the phone so expertly, Bell quietly replied in his soft Scottish accent, "My name is Alexander Graham Bell, and I invented it." The two men soon became close friends, and the next year, when Bell returned to Bedeque, he convinced Arthur McCurdy to become his personal assistant. Bell built a beautiful home called Benvrea on the peninsula overlooking Bedeque, and it was here that he built his laboratory to carry on his scientific experiments of flight. As a small boy who was born and bred in Bedeque, McCurdy could be found at Benvrea helping Bell with his glider and kite experiments. During his childhood, McCurdy met many of the famous scientists and inventors drawn to this hamlet because of Dr. Bell's worldwide reputation. Having lost 2 sons in infancy, Bell wanted to adopt my grandfather. So strong was the bond that had developed between the two men. Bell did, however, attend the christening of John Alexander Douglas. becoming a godfather to my grandfather. Recognizing McCurdy to be a brilliant student, Dr. Bell helped sponsor his education to St. Andrew's College in Aurora, Ontario. McCurdy was just 16 years old when he left St. Andrews to attend the University of Toronto's School of Mechanical Engineering, and was a mere 20 years old when he completed his engineering degree in 1906 and returned to Quebec. He invited his best friend, Casey Baldwin, a fellow U of T engineer, to join him for a 2-week holiday. But Baldwin's vacation would turn into a lifelong visit. Such was the allure of Cape Breton. I recall my grandfather relating to me how the Aerial Experiment Association was created. It was on a windy, miserable night in September of 1907. And Dr. Bell, Casey Baldwin, and I were all in the big living room of Benvrea, warming our backs against the fireplace and talking over our kite flights of that day. Mrs. Bell came in with some hot coffee, watched the conversation for a few moments and said, "Now, Alex, you have some pretty smart engineers here, and they're as interested in flight as you are. Why don't we form an organization?" Thus, the Aerial Experiment Association was born on October the 1st, 1907, to test the feasibility of powered flight. Members of the group called themselves associates and were 5 in number: Alexander Graham Bell, J.E.D. McCurdy, Casey Baldwin, Thomas Selfridge, and Glenn Curtis. The Aerial Experiment Association was formed with one purpose in mind: to get a man into the air. Commenting on the AEA, Dr. Bell said, "We breathed an atmosphere of aviation from morning till night, and almost from night to morning. I may say for myself that this association with these young men proved to be one of the happiest times of my life." The first of the 4 airplanes built by the Aerial Experiment Association at the beginning of 1908, the Red Wing, crashed on its second flight due to the pilot, Casey Baldwin, having no lateral control. The inventive minds of the AEA went into action, devising a hinge-controllable arrangement of movable wingtips called little wings, which, when built into the White Wing, the AEA's second airplane, proved their worth from the beginning. The Junebug and the Silver Dart, the AEA's third and fourth aeroplanes, subsequently had ailerons installed. 2 of the most notable and lasting achievements of the AEA were the development of the aileron and the tricycle landing gear. In a 1949 CBC interview from Government House, Halifax, my grandfather said of the aileron, "This is a system used universally to this day, and I consider it to be Canada's outstanding contribution to aircraft development." In an attempt to demonstrate the maneuverability of an airplane through the use of ailerons, McCurdy made the first figure 8 in the world on August 29, 1908. McCurdy was a true visionary of his time, with his accomplishments ranking in the world vanguard of aviation. He was the first in the world to utilize a water-cooled engine, this being on the Silver Dart. Whilst demonstrating the potential of airplanes in front of the military in Petawawa, Ontario in 1909, he took Casey Baldwin up on August the 2nd as Canada's first passenger. Along with Baldwin, he formed the first aircraft production company in April of 1909, the Canadian Aerodrome Company. McCurdy is attributed with sending the first wireless message from an airplane on August 29, 1910, over Sheepshead Bay, New York. In October 1910, he became the first Canadian to be issued a pilot's license. However, McCurdy's flight was not just the first one in Canada, but it was also the first flight by a British subject in the British Empire And accordingly, Great Britain's pilot's license number 1 was granted to McCurdy. His airplane factory in Toronto during the First World War produced the JN-4 or Jenny, and the world's first twin-engine bomber for the Royal Navy. He made the first intercity flight in Canada on August 2nd, 1911, when he flew in a 32-mile race from Hamilton to Toronto, which he won, despite giving his competitor a 10-minute start. McCurdy flew the world's first flying boat on Badak Bay on June the 1st, 1910, and made the first oceanic flight from Florida to Cuba on January the 30th, 1911. He also made the first flight in Mexico City. He contributed enormously to the development of the AERO, the tricycle landing gear, and pontoons, the latter helping to transform Canada's vast hinterland of lakes into thousands of landing places, thereby opening up Canada's immense wilderness to the earliest bush pilots. In 2012, McCurdy was inducted into the Canadian Science and Engineering Hall of Fame, the pantheon of engineering excellence. Canada's first aviation school, the McCurdy Aviation School, was established in Long Branch, Toronto in April of 1915, a fact referred to by an historic plaque, which you can view today. An arrangement was set up whereby members of the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps came from Great Britain. And together with Canadian students, 300 pilots received their wings from McCurdy, many of whom went on to become some of the finest airmen in the Empire. The Aerial Experiment Association disbanded on March 31st, 1909, and McCurdy, forever thinking of the future, wanted to convince the Canadian government of the potential of the airplane for commercial use and for any future conflicts. Arrangements were made with Ottawa for McCurdy and Baldwin to come to Petawawa to demonstrate the Silver Dart's flying capabilities in front of the appropriate military personnel. I recall my grandfather saying that he made 5 flights without incident in August of 1909, except for the last one when he came in to land and his wheels bumped on a small knoll on the sandy terrain, flipping the Silver Dart over on her nose and demolishing her, and causing my grandfather to sustain the only injury ever in his aviation career, a broken nose. Sadly, the official solemnly ruled that airplanes would have no place in modern defense. Even the onset of the First World War did not change the mind of the Canadian government, with Sir Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia and Defense, blustering at McCurdy, "My boy, the airplane is an invention of the devil and will never play any part in such a serious business as the defense of a nation." McCurdy flushed and said quietly, "I am sure you will live to regret those words, General Hughes." Eventually, the government finally established the Royal Canadian Air Force on April the 1st, 1924. McCurdy's dream that Canada have its own Air Force, originally proposed by him in 1909, finally became a reality. And Prime Minister Borden, who had been subjected to McCurdy's entreaties to establish an air arm, later acknowledged that McCurdy had been the prime driving force behind the creation of the Royal Canadian Air Force. After the disappointment of Petawawa, McCurdy decided to do some exhibition flying to hone his flying skills and make some money. He decided to go to the United States, where from the beginning he was a sensational success, bringing thousands of people out to see him fly in numerous American cities. And as the temperature dropped, he moved further south towards the warmer climes until he eventually reached Florida. One day he set himself the challenge of flying the 90 or so miles to Havana, Cuba, from Key West, Florida, McCurdy set off on January the 30th, 1911. And flying at 38 miles per hour, and to help guide him, he had 6 American destroyers, evenly spaced between Florida and Cuba, each puffing out smoke as a means of navigation, as well as a means of rescue from the shark-infested waters, should he come down. Then I heard a loud noise behind me and knew instantly that something had gone wrong. He noticed he was leaking oil. Within tantalizing sight of his destination, McCurdy shut down his engine, with no choice but to glide to a gentle landing on the ocean. Always a cautious man, my grandfather had fitted his biplane with 2 pontoons, another first, in the event he was forced to ditch. The USS Pauling took only 4.5 minutes to reach my grandfather. I didn't even get my feet wet, McCurdy recalled. My grandfather told me that his instruments for this flight simply consisted of a $1 watch and a 5-cent compass. The Cubans were so impressed by my grandfather's courage and flying skills that President Gomez held a state banquet in his honor in Havana's ornate opera house, during which the president handed McCurdy an envelope containing a monetary award. But when McCurdy broke the presidential seal, he found nothing but a few newspaper clippings. He had, however, made 3 world records. He had made the longest flight over water at that time, over 90 miles. He was the first pilot to fly out of sight of land on a clear day, and he was airborne for 2 hours and 26 minutes. After the end of World War I, McCurdy turned his talents to manufacturing aircraft for civilian use. In 1928, he formed the Reed Aircraft Company and established a plant here in Montreal for the manufacture of various types of commercial planes. The following year, the company became the Curtiss Reed Aircraft Company, and its name became known the world over as the premier builder of commercial aircraft, with McCurdy as its president. In 1933, McCurdy was invited to Britain and Germany as the honored guest of several of the new aircraft manufacturers to discuss the problem of metal fatigue and vibration. He visited the imposing Zeppelin plant at Lake Constance, and he also met a young and little-known chief designer and engineer whose intelligence much impressed him. The name of that man was Willy Messerschmitt. My grandfather mentioned to me that he found it chilling that only a few years later Canada and its allies would be matched up against some of the airplanes that Messerschmitt had discussed with him, most notably the Bf-109 Messerschmitt and the Me-262 fighter aircraft. With the advent of World War II, McCurdy was appointed the Assistant Director of Aircraft Production, drawing upon his experience of setting up Canada's first aerodrome and pilot training school during the First World War. McCurdy utilized his experience to help the Commonwealth governments formulate the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. This plan remains the single largest aviation program in history and was responsible for graduating 131,553 navigators, bomb aimers, gunners, wireless operators, pilots, and flight engineers for the Commonwealth Air Forces during the Second World War. In recognition of his sterling contribution to the Canadian war effort, McCurdy was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire. On October the 4th, 1957, McCurdy was the honored guest at the unveiling of the AERO in front of a crowd of 12,000 at the AERO plant in Moulton. He had been privy to the AERO's progress through his association as a consultant with the 2 chief designers and aeronautical engineers, James Chamberlain and Jim Floyd. His career reached a high point when Prime Minister Mackenzie King appointed McCurdy Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. In 1953, the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute created the McCurdy Award for outstanding achievement in the art, science, and engineering relating to aeronautics and space research, which I had the honor last night of presenting to Stephen McCullough. In 1959, the Royal Canadian Air Force celebrated the 50th anniversary of his historic flight by building and flying a replica of the Silver Dart over Badore Lake on February the 23rd, 1959. That same year, McCurdy won the McKee Trophy for lifelong contributions to the advancement of Canadian aviation. The Royal Canadian Air Force Association established the J.E.D. McCurdy Trophy to recognize outstanding and praiseworthy achievements in the field of civil aviation in Canada. In 1959, the Queen appointed my grandfather an honorary Air Commodore, the only other person at that time sharing the same distinction was Sir Winston Churchill. That same year, the Royal Canadian Air Force appointed McCurdy the first civilian honorary colonel of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and it has been a singular honor for me to carry on this tradition in my role as an honorary colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force. I had the privilege of being part of the team which built the 2009 Silver Dart replica. I heard that the replica was being constructed by a group of volunteers in Welland, Ontario, and I arranged to be taken to the hangar. The highlight of my visit was being in the presence of the Silver Dart and feeling it and being allowed to sit in the cockpit. The only problem was they couldn't get me out. The replica which we constructed is as true to the original design as possible. The Silver Dart measures 49 feet, 1 inch wide, 39 feet, 4 inches long, 9 feet, 7 inches tall, with a wing area of 420 square feet. Instead of being air-cooled, the Silver Dart was water-cooled and was the first successful aircraft motor of this type in the world. The Silver Dart's weight, fully loaded with my grandfather and petrol, was 860 pounds and had a maximum speed of 40 miles per hour with a range of 20 miles. Sitka spruce, bamboo, maple, and ash were employed in the fuselage structure and in the horizontal wing structural spars, vertical struts, wood ribs, and strut jackets. Throw in some wire, steel tubing, modern wing fabric coverings, good quality tape, and that pretty well encompasses all that was used. You cannot begin to imagine my pride as I toiled on the replica, and I truly felt my grandfather's presence in that cold hangar as the Silver Dart began to take on its iconic form. Amanda, my wife, and Emma, our daughter, and I were down in Bedeck, Nova Scotia in February 2009 for the centennial of flight celebrations, as was Jeffrey Languedoc. 100 years later, the Aerial Experiment Association 2005 group duplicated the 1909 feat by flying our replica Silver Dart over the same expanse of frozen ice. Our pilot was a former Canadian astronaut, Bjarne Tryggvason, who was the payload specialist on the 1997 Space Shuttle. Astronaut Tryggvason described the first flight of the Silver Dart in his century as majestic. Having flown the Silver Dart and the Space Shuttle, he is immensely proud to say that he has gone from flying the highest and the fastest to the lowest and the slowest. What a breathtaking moment it was to see the Silver Dart take to the skies. It was as if time had stood still, and when somebody asked me, "Oh, what would your grandfather do if he were here with us today?" I answered that he'd probably say, "Move over. I'd like to fly her now." With a mighty roar, we were brought back to the present with the sound of the F-86 Saberjet and the two F-18s as they made several passes over Bedeck Bay, dipping their wings in salute to the airplane that initiated Canada's rich aviation history. To honor his legacy and as a fitting tribute to my grandfather, which was long overdue, on July the 27th, 2009, Amanda and I flew down to Sydney, Nova Scotia, where 100 years later, the renaming of Sydney Airport to the J.A. Douglas McCurdy Sydney Airport took place. Our cherished nation continues to produce people and organizations such as yourselves who have accepted the challenge of pushing the boundaries of aviation. You are the generation who will carry the mantle of keeping Canada at the forefront of worldwide aeronautical excellence into the 21st century. I am reminded of the words of Sir Isaac Newton, "If I have seen further, it is only by standing on the shoulders of giants." Finally, I would like to repeat my grandfather, in his own words, how he described that historic moment, February the 23rd, 1909. The whole scene is still very vivid to me. It was a brilliant day, in more ways than one. The sun was glaring down on the ice of Lake Bredor, which is near Bedeck. The town had turned out in a festive mood, done up in mufflers and heavy fur hats. The town, by the way, consisted largely of very doubtful Scotsmen. Most of them were mounted on skates, the kind you strap to your feet. They didn't say much, just came to wait and see. The aeroplane, or aerodrome, as Dr. Bell referred to it, was surrounded by people. During the early afternoon, it was wheeled into place. The propeller was cranked, and with a cough, the motor snorted into life. I climbed into the pilot's seat. With an extra snort from the motor, we scooted off down the ice. Behind came a crowd of small boys and men on their skates, most of them still doubtful that I would fly. With a lurch and a mighty straining of wires, we were in the air. It was amusing to look back and watch the skaters. They seemed to be going in every direction and bumping into each other in their excitement at seeing a man actually fly. In taking off, I had to clear one old Scot, so doubtful I would fly, that he had started off across the ice with his horse and sleigh. I think they both had the daylight scared out of them. I traveled 3/4 of a mile at a height of about 30 feet before coming to the surface of the ice. I will say the doubting ones overcame their feelings in short order. The latter years of my grandfather's life were spent here in Montreal, where he died on the 25th of June, 1961. J.D. McCurdy is buried in his home village of Bedeck, where, at his request, his tombstone faces Bredor Lake, from where he made his historic flight, and from where Canadian aviation took its first steps. He placed his hand on the arc of history and bent it towards the milestone of Canadian aviation. An engineer by profession and an innovator and an adventurer by spirit, he was the astronaut of his time. Thank you. That's all. That's all for today. You will. You will.
Thank you so much, Gerald. It's a thrill for us, or for me anyway, and hopefully for you, to be taken through a very quick historical review of the last 100 years or so, or more of the Canadian aviation experience through the life and times of J.A.D. McCurdy and his grandson, Gerald. Thank you so much, Gerald. My pleasure. I really appreciate it. I'm sure we all did. This draws to a close AERO 2019. Thank you all for coming. AERO 2021, we will begin to plan on Monday morning. We'll take tomorrow off. And look forward, hopefully, to seeing you perhaps next year at a hypersonics conference we'll be running at the end of March, very likely in this hotel, in collaboration with our sister society in the U.S., AIAA, the American Institute for Aeronautics and Astronautics. And then in May, we'll be holding our regular space conference, Astro 2020. So I wish you all safe travels home and hope to see you all again soon. Bye-bye now.